She had cleaned thousands of designer outfits for wealthy customers who never bothered to learn her name. But when Victoria Blackwood's coat fell and a family photo scattered across the floor, the dry cleaner worker froze. There was her daughter, her son-in-law, and a granddaughter she'd never met, the family that had erased her from their lives 30 years ago. Welcome to the Untold Stories, where broken hearts find unexpected healing. Before we dive into this powerful story of lost love, family secrets, and the chance for redemption, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories of forgiveness and second chances deserve to be shared, hit that subscribe button right now. These are the tales that remind us family bonds can survive even the deepest wounds, waiting for the perfect moment to heal what was broken. Margaret Sullivan had been working at Prestige Dry Cleaning on the Upper East Side of Manhattan for 15 long years. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she would unlock the doors of the upscale establishment, turn on the machines, and prepare for another day of serving New York's wealthy elite who saw her as nothing more than invisible help, a necessary service worker who processed their expensive garments with quiet efficiency. The customers who frequented Prestige Dry Cleaning lived in a world that Margaret could only observe from behind the counter. Designer suits worth more than her monthly rent, evening gowns that cost more than her yearly salary, luxury items that represented a lifestyle she had once known but lost forever. They spoke to her in clipped, demanding tones, if they bothered to acknowledge her existence at all. Margaret accepted their condescension with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that survival sometimes meant swallowing pride. At 63 years old, she couldn't afford to lose this job that provided her modest income and health insurance. She lived alone in a tiny studio apartment in Queens, taking the subway every day to clean clothes for people who would never invite her into their world. What none of these wealthy customers knew was that Margaret Sullivan had once been Margaret Ashford, daughter of one of Manhattan's most prominent families. She had grown up in a Fifth Avenue penthouse, attended the finest private schools, and been groomed for a life of privilege and social prominence. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels, and her mother sat on the boards of multiple charitable organizations. But 30 years ago, Margaret had committed what her family considered the ultimate betrayal. She had fallen in love with Patrick Sullivan, a working-class construction worker from Brooklyn who possessed neither wealth nor social standing. When she announced her intention to marry him, her parents delivered an ultimatum that would shatter her world forever and divide their family permanently. "Choose him or choose us," her father had declared with cold finality during a confrontation that Margaret still remembered with painful clarity after 3 decades. "You will not disgrace this family by marrying beneath your station. If you go through with this marriage, you are no longer our daughter. You will be dead to us, and we will never speak your name again in this house." Margaret had chosen love over money, Patrick over privilege, and her family had kept their cruel promise. They disowned her completely, cut off all financial support, and instructed their social circle to treat her as if she had never existed. Her younger sister Victoria, who was only 16 at the time, was forbidden from maintaining any contact with her banished older sister. For 25 beautiful years, Margaret and Patrick had built a happy life together despite their modest circumstances. They had struggled financially, but were rich in love, laughter, and shared dreams. Patrick had worked construction during the day and studied business at night, eventually starting his own small contracting company. Margaret had worked various jobs to help support their dreams. They had tried to have children for years, undergoing expensive fertility treatments that drained their savings, but never quite achieved the family they desperately wanted. Just when they had finally saved enough money to adopt, tragedy struck with devastating suddenness. Patrick suffered a massive heart attack at age 52 and died instantly on a construction site, leaving Margaret alone and heartbroken. Without Patrick's income and facing mounting medical bills from his final hospitalization, Margaret had lost their small home and most of their possessions. At age 48, she found herself starting over with nothing but memories and the skills she had learned during years of working various service jobs. The dry cleaning position had been a lifeline that allowed her to survive in the expensive city she had once ruled. For 15 years, Margaret had processed the clothing of Manhattan's elite, always wondering if she might someday encounter someone from her former life. She had changed her surname from Ashford to Sullivan after her marriage, and time had aged her appearance, enough that she felt reasonably confident that she wouldn't be recognized by anyone from her privileged past. Tuesday morning, November 18th, started like any other day at Prestige Dry Cleaning. Margaret arrived early, prepared the machines, and began processing the garments that had been dropped off the previous evening. The morning rush brought the usual parade of demanding customers who dropped off expensive items with barely a glance at the woman who would carefully restore their clothing. At 10:47 a.m., the front door chimed, and a woman entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having her needs prioritized above others. She was approximately 46 years old, impeccably dressed in designer clothes, with perfectly styled blonde hair and jewelry that cost more than most people earned in a year. She carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of old money and social privilege. Margaret looked up from the register to greet the customer and felt the world shift beneath her feet. Despite 30 years of separation, despite the expensive cosmetic surgery and carefully maintained appearance, she recognized the face immediately. This was Victoria Ashford Blackwood, her baby sister, now a grown woman living the privileged life that Margaret had abandoned for love. Victoria approached the counter with the imperious manner of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted in her entire life. "I need this coat cleaned and pressed for tomorrow evening," she announced without bothering to make eye contact with Margaret. "It's a vintage Chanel that cost more than you probably make in 6 months, so I expect it to be handled with appropriate care and expertise." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the expensive coat, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Victoria must be able to hear it. Her sister had grown into a beautiful woman, but there was a coldness in her manner that reminded Margaret painfully of their father's cruel dismissal all those years ago. Victoria had clearly embraced the family's values of wealth and social superiority. "Of course, ma'am," Margaret managed to say in a voice that she prayed sounded normal and professional. "We'll take excellent care of your coat. When do you need it ready?" She focused on writing the cleaning ticket, afraid that prolonged eye contact might trigger some flicker of recognition in Victoria's memory, even after 3 decades of separation and the changes that poverty had wrought. Victoria glanced at her expensive watch with obvious impatience. "Tomorrow at 5 p.m. sharp. I'm attending a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum, and this coat is part of an ensemble that was featured in Vogue last month. If there's even the slightest damage or delay, I'll hold you personally responsible." Her tone carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never doubted her own importance. As Victoria began to turn away, her expensive handbag caught on the coat hanger and pulled everything to the floor in a cascade of fabric and scattered contents. Margaret immediately bent to help gather the items, her service worker's instincts overriding the emotional turmoil of being so close to the sister who had been stolen from her by their parents. Unforgiving demands for social conformity. That's when Margaret saw it, a family photograph that had fallen from Victoria's purse and landed face up on the polished floor. The image hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. There was Victoria, elegant and smiling, standing next to a distinguished man in an expensive suit who was obviously her husband, a member of New York's social elite. But it was the third figure in the photograph that shattered Margaret's heart and changed everything. A little girl, perhaps 8 years old, with Margaret's own eyes and smile staring back at her from the photo. This was her granddaughter, a child she had never met, never held, never known existed. The family that had erased her from their lives had continued without her, creating new generations. Margaret picked up the photograph with hands that shook so violently she nearly dropped it again. "Your daughter?" she whispered, the words barely audible. Victoria snatched the photo away with obvious irritation. "My daughter Emma. She's 8 years old and already showing remarkable academic promise. She'll be attending the same prep school that our family has attended for 4 generations." The casual mention of our family cut through Margaret like a knife, because she knew she was no longer part of that legacy. Her granddaughter would grow up learning the same values of wealth and social superiority that had destroyed their family, never knowing that she had a grandmother who had chosen love over money and paid the ultimate price for that choice decades ago. "She's beautiful," Margaret managed to say, fighting back tears as she imagined all the birthdays, holidays, and precious moments she had missed and would continue to miss. Victoria's expression softened slightly for just a moment, the way any mother's would when her child was complimented, but then her social conditioning reasserted itself, and she became cold and distant once again. "Yes, well, she comes from excellent stock," Victoria replied with the casual arrogance that had been bred into her since childhood. "My husband's family has been prominent in New York society for over a century, and our family legacy speaks for itself. Emma will have every advantage that money and social position can provide." The implication was clear. Advantages that people like Margaret could never understand. Margaret carefully hung Victoria's coat and completed the cleaning ticket, each movement requiring tremendous effort to maintain her professional composure while her heart was breaking into smaller pieces with every passing second. This was her sister, her granddaughter's mother, and she was being treated like invisible help by someone who had once shared her childhood bedroom. "Will there be anything else, Mrs. Blackwood?" Margaret asked, using her sister's married name like a dagger through her own heart. Victoria was already checking her phone, clearly eager to leave this interaction behind and return to her privileged world, where service workers were merely part of the background scenery of her wealthy existence. "Just ensure that the coat is perfect," Victoria commanded without looking up from her phone. "I don't have time to deal with incompetence or excuses." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And make sure the cleaning solution doesn't leave any chemical odor. I'm sensitive to cheap products." The casual insult hung in the air as Victoria exited, leaving Margaret alone with her shattered heart. Margaret collapsed onto the stool behind the counter as soon as Victoria disappeared from view, her entire body shaking with suppressed sobs that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. 30 years of wondering what had become of her family, 30 years of hoping for reconciliation, and this was the answer. Her sister had become exactly what their parents had wanted her to be. That evening, Margaret sat in her small apartment staring at her wedding photo with Patrick, wondering what he would have advised her to do about this impossible situation. Should she reveal her identity to Victoria and risk being rejected again? Should she try to meet her granddaughter somehow? Or should she remain silent and continue washing her sister's clothes while pretending to be a stranger? The next day, Margaret spent extra time carefully cleaning Victoria's vintage Chanel coat, treating it like the precious heirloom it was despite the pain that handling it caused her. Every stitch reminded her of the life she had abandoned, the family she had lost, and the granddaughter she might never have the chance to know. At exactly 5 p.m., Victoria returned to collect her garment. "I trust everything is satisfactory?" Margaret asked, as Victoria examined the coat with the critical eye of someone who expected perfection as her natural right. Victoria nodded curtly, apparently finding no fault with Margaret's meticulous work. "It's acceptable," she said, as if praising the help too enthusiastically would somehow diminish her own superior social position. As Victoria prepared to leave, Margaret made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said quietly, her voice barely steady enough to form the words, I was wondering, do you have any siblings? Victoria stopped and turned, her expression showing mild surprise that the help would dare to engage in personal conversation. I had an older sister once, Victoria replied with carefully controlled emotion. But she chose to disgrace our family by marrying a nobody and was disowned 30 years ago. As far as I'm concerned, I've been an only child since then. Some choices have permanent consequences, and she made hers. The coldness in Victoria's voice revealed that she had fully embraced their parents' unforgiving philosophy. Margaret felt her heart break all over again as she realized that Victoria harbored no regret, no curiosity, no love for the sister she had lost. I see, Margaret whispered, fighting back tears. That must have been very difficult for your family. Victoria shrugged dismissively. It was better for everyone involved. She would never have fit into our world anyway. As Victoria turned to leave once more, Margaret made one final desperate attempt to bridge the gap between them. Your daughter Emma, she said softly. She looks like she has kind eyes. I'm sure she's a wonderful child. Victoria's expression softened just slightly. She is. She's everything our family could hope for in the next generation. I'm sure her grandmother would be very proud, Margaret ventured, her voice breaking slightly on the word grandmother. Victoria's face immediately hardened again. Her grandmothers are both deceased, she said coldly. Emma has no grandparents living. That chapter of family history is permanently closed. With that crushing final statement, Victoria walked out of the store forever. Margaret stood alone behind the counter, finally understanding that some wounds never heal and some choices truly do have permanent consequences. Her sister had chosen to honor their parents' cruel legacy rather than forgive and reconcile. The granddaughter she would never meet was being raised to perpetuate the same values of wealth and social superiority that had destroyed their family. But that night, as Margaret looked at herself in the mirror of her tiny apartment, she realized something important. She had chosen love over money 30 years ago, and despite the pain and poverty that choice had brought, she regretted nothing. Patrick had given her 25 years of genuine happiness that no amount of wealth could have purchased from their cold, privileged world. Margaret Sullivan continued working at Prestige Dry Cleaning, serving wealthy customers who would never know her story or understand the price she had paid for choosing love over money. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is living with the consequences of doing what your heart knows is right, even when the world punishes you for it. Subscribe if you believe love is worth any sacrifice. Some choices echo through generations.